Deep in the isolated, densely wooded Sans Boys mountains of Oklahoma, a white pickup truck sits abandoned on a dirt logging road, exactly where it was parked days earlier. The doors are locked from the inside. Pressed against the glass of the cab, a starving, half-dead dog whimpers weakly, too exhausted to bark, too far gone to do anything but wait. When investigators finally force the door open, what they find inside doesn't make sense. Sitting undisturbed in the center console is a bank bag stuffed with $32,000 in cash. Untouched, uncounted, just sitting there in plain view. The family's wallets are still inside. Their identification, their cell phones, their winter coats, folded on the back seat, exactly the kind of thing you desperately need if you were about to walk out into freezing mountain air. And tucked among the belongings, investigators find something that will follow this case for years afterward. A blurry, out-of-focus photograph of a 6-year-old girl, standing alone against a rocky outcropping, staring directly into the camera with an expression that no child should ever wear. But the family that owned this truck, Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their little girl Madison, are simply gone. Not missing in the ordinary sense, where you eventually find a trail, a witness, a lead that goes somewhere. Gone in a way that leaves behind nothing but strange security footage, a locked truck full of untouched money, and a small mountain of local rumors ranging from drug cartels to demonic possession. This isn't a horror movie premise dressed up for entertainment. This actually happened to a real family in the fall of 2009. Tonight we're going to walk through exactly what's known, exactly what was found, and exactly where the evidence simply stops making sense. Lock your doors. Pull the blanket up a little higher than usual. And whatever you do, try not to look too long at that photograph once we get to it. Before we step into those woods together, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because Midnight Whispers exists for exactly this. The true stories that refuse to resolve themselves, engineered to sit with you long after the lights go out. Let's begin. To understand how a family disappears this completely, you have to go back several months before that truck was ever found, to a sprawling rural property outside the small town of Eufaula, Oklahoma, where Bobby and Sherilyn Jamison were raising their daughter Madison. From the road, it would have looked like an ordinary home. A family, a dog, a quiet stretch of land far enough from town to feel private rather than isolated. But by the fall of 2009, something had shifted dramatically behind those walls, and the people closest to the family had started to notice. Both Bobby and Sherilyn had been carrying significant, unresolved trauma in the months leading up to their disappearance. Bobby had survived a violent car accident that left him in a state of chronic, grinding back pain. The kind of pain that doesn't just wear down your body, but slowly erodes your ability to think clearly, sleep properly, or manage stress the way you once could. Sherilyn, separately, had a documented history of bipolar disorder and severe depressive episodes. Conditions that, left unmanaged or destabilized by outside pressure, can produce genuinely frightening symptoms in even the gentlest, most grounded people. Rumors circulated afterward, as they always do in cases like this, that the couple had turned to methamphetamine to cope with the physical and emotional weight they were both carrying. It's a theory that would explain a lot, and it's one investigators took seriously enough to search the property thoroughly for evidence. They found none. No drugs in the house, no paraphernalia, nothing to definitively confirm the theory that would have offered the simplest explanation for what came next. What they found instead, based on accounts from neighbors, friends, and even the family's own pastor, was something considerably harder to categorize, a household in the grip of what appears to have been a full-blown, shared psychological crisis. Bobby began confiding in his pastor that the house was haunted, not in the vague, unsettling way people sometimes describe an old home with strange noises, but specifically, insistently. He described an entire family of malevolent spirits that he believed had taken up residence on the roof of his house, watching, waiting, tormenting his family from directly above where they slept. He told friends he had prepared what he called a special bullet, one he intended to use on whatever, or whoever, was stalking them from above. Sherilyn's fear seems to have manifested in an equally alarming, if slightly different, direction. She purchased a .22 caliber pistol for the home. She began leaving handwritten notes scattered around the property. Cryptic, urgent, occasionally outright hostile in tone. On the side of a large shipping container sitting in their yard, she spray-painted a sprawling, aggressive warning, apparently directed at whoever she believed had been poisoning the family's cats. Whether that threat was real, imagined, or some blend of the two that had calcified into certainty inside a mind under enormous strain, we may never know. But it tells you something important about the emotional temperature inside that house in the weeks before the family vanished. They weren't just anxious. They believed, with total conviction, that something out there was actively hunting them. The Jamisons responded to this perceived threat the way you might expect two frightened, exhausted people to respond when they no longer trust the walls around them. They installed an elaborate, expensive security camera system with lenses angled to cover every conceivable approach to the property. The driveway, the yard, the tree line at the edge of their land. They were no longer simply living in that house. They were fortifying it, preparing for a siege against an enemy that, as far as anyone else could tell, existed only inside their own fractured perception of reality. It's worth pausing here on how gradual and, in a strange way, how internally logical this kind of decline can look from the inside, even as it appears increasingly alarming to everyone standing outside of it. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides, out of nowhere, to believe their roof is inhabited by a family of hostile spirits. That kind of conviction tends to build in layers, each one reinforcing the last. A strange noise at night gets attributed to something specific rather than dismissed as an old house settling. A run of bad luck, a sick pet, a financial setback, an unexplained ache, gets folded into the same explanatory framework, because once you believe something malevolent is targeting your family, nearly everything that goes wrong starts to feel like further proof, rather than coincidence. Neighbors who spoke to local reporters in the aftermath of the disappearance described a family that had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to October 2009. Fewer casual visits, blinds kept drawn during the day, a noticeable new wariness in how Bobby and Sherilyn interacted with people who had once been considered close friends. None of these details, on their own, would raise much alarm. Plenty of families go through quiet, private periods of withdrawal for entirely mundane reasons, but layered together with everything else. The pistol, the spray-painted warning, the pastor's account of demons on the roof. A picture starts to emerge of two people who had, by the fall of that year, become almost entirely isolated inside a shared reality that no longer had much room left for outside input or gentle correction. It's also worth acknowledging how difficult it can be, even for people who love someone deeply, to recognize a mental health crisis of this scale while it's actively unfolding, particularly when both members of a couple are affected simultaneously. If only one partner had been struggling, the other might have eventually recognized the severity of what was happening and sought help, whether from a doctor, a pastor, or simply a trusted friend willing to intervene. But with both Bobby and Sherilyn apparently caught in the same escalating spiral, there was no one left inside that household to serve as the reality check the situation so desperately needed. The most terrifying evidence of their psychological collapse wasn't a note or a weapon, though. It was a piece of video footage that would later chill investigators to their core. On the morning of October 8th, 2009, the Jamisons' own home security system quietly recorded what would become the final documented hours of the family's life before they drove into the Sands Boys mountains and disappeared. The footage shows Bobby and Sherilyn loading their white pickup truck for what they had told at least one person was a trip to look at a 40-acre plot of land they were considering purchasing. On paper, it's an unremarkable errand, a couple loading a truck for a day trip. But the way they move on that footage is anything but unremarkable. Watch the silent, grainy black and white recording, and you'll notice it almost immediately. Something about their movement is wrong in a way that's hard to articulate at first, and impossible to shake once you've noticed it. Bobby and Sherilyn walk back and forth between the house and the truck over a dozen separate trips, carrying small, seemingly random items each time. But their posture is stiff, mechanical. Their eyes, in the few moments the camera catches their faces clearly, appear to stare straight ahead, fixed on nothing in particular, as though they're looking through the world in front of them rather than at it. Across more than a dozen trips back and forth, they never once look at each other. They never appear to exchange a single word. At one, especially strange moment captured on the footage, both of them simply stop moving entirely and stand in the yard, staring silently out toward the empty tree line, as though waiting for some instruction that never audibly comes. It's the kind of footage that invites two very different interpretations, and investigators have never definitively settled on either one. Was this the visible signature of a severe, shared, drug-induced psychosis? Two people so deep into a substance-fueled break from reality that their own bodies had started moving without full conscious participation? Or was this the behavior of two people who had been terrified into an almost trance-like silence by something, or someone, standing just outside the frame of their own security cameras? Someone real enough to make them move like hostages rather than homeowners? There's one more detail from that footage that has haunted this case for over a decade. One that becomes considerably more important once you understand what investigators eventually found and didn't find at the abandoned truck days later. At one point in the recording, Bobby is seen carrying a small brown briefcase out to the truck, loading it carefully, almost protectively, as though its contents mattered more than anything else they were bringing on this trip. When police eventually located the truck, days after the family vanished, that $32,000 in cash was sitting untouched on the seat. The brown briefcase was gone. What was inside that case? Something apparently valuable enough to disappear entirely, while $32,000 in raw cash was simply left behind, is a question this case has never answered. We'll come back to it, because it may be one of the most important and most overlooked details in the entire disappearance. The family finished loading the truck. They drove north, up into the isolated, densely forested terrain of the Sans Bois Mountains, under the stated purpose of looking at land they were considering buying. They parked on a muddy, remote logging trail, far from the nearest paved road. And then, as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, they simply ceased to exist. When hunters eventually stumbled across the locked, abandoned truck days after the family had last been seen, the resulting search effort, extensive, well-resourced, involving search dogs, aircraft, and dozens of volunteers combing through some of the most rugged terrain in the state, turned up absolutely nothing, no footprints leading away from the vehicle in any usable, trackable pattern. No torn clothing snagged on branches. No blood, no signs of struggle, no discarded personal items marking a trail into the woods. The truck's own GPS data indicated the vehicle had arrived at that exact spot and simply never moved again. Inside the locked cab, the family's dog, a small dog named Maisie, had somehow survived for days, alone, trapped, reduced to eating her own waste just to stay alive long enough to be found. Her survival is, in its own quiet way, one of the most haunting details of the entire case. Proof that whatever happened to this family, it happened fast enough and completely enough that nobody ever came back to check on the dog they surely loved. Which raises the two questions that have never stopped circling this case since the very beginning. Why were the doors locked from the inside? And why was $32,000 left sitting in plain view, completely untouched? Investigators and armchair researchers who've obsessed over this case for over a decade since have generally converged on three competing theories, none of which fully accounts for every piece of evidence on its own. The first theory involves the cartel. $32,000 is an enormous amount of cash to be carrying into a remote mountain logging road, and the theory holds that Bobby may have been involved in some kind of drug transaction that went catastrophically wrong. Under this theory, the family may have driven into those mountains to meet someone specific. Someone dangerous enough to force the entire family out of the truck at gunpoint, take whatever was inside that brown briefcase, and deliberately leave the cash behind as either a message, a taunt, or simple indifference to money that, in the world of serious trafficking, might have represented a comparatively small sum. It's a theory that would neatly explain the locked doors, perhaps locked by whoever confronted the family, ensuring the dog wouldn't escape or draw attention. It doesn't fully explain why cash, in a criminal transaction supposedly built around cash, would be the one item left behind entirely untouched. The second theory involves a cult operating deep in the wilderness. The Sans Bois Mountains have long carried a regional reputation for isolated, off-the-grid communities, some organized around fringe religious beliefs, operating largely outside the reach or interest of local law enforcement. Sherilyn's own mother, in the years following the disappearance, publicly and repeatedly stated her belief that the family had been targeted by a violent religious group active somewhere in that wilderness. A group she believed the family may have unknowingly stumbled into contact with, whether through the land they were supposedly there to view or through some other connection investigators were never able to fully trace. Under this theory, the trance-like behavior captured on the home security footage takes on a different, considerably darker meaning. Not drug-induced psychosis, but the visible aftermath of coercion, threat, or even ritualized psychological control exerted on the family in the days or hours before they ever left their own driveway. The third theory is the hardest one to sit with, because it doesn't require an external villain at all. Under this reading, the escalating paranoia documented in the months before the disappearance, the belief in spirits on the roof, the special bullet, the notes about poisoned cats, the elaborate security system built to guard against a threat no one else could see, represents the slow, tragic unraveling of two people's minds, whether from untreated mental illness, substance use, or some devastating combination of both. Under this theory, Bobby and Sherilyn didn't drive their daughter into the Sands Boy Mountains to view land at all. They drove her there to escape something they had come to believe, with total sincerity, was going to kill them if they stayed. And somewhere in those woods, exhausted, terrified, and completely disconnected from any rescue that could have reached them in time, the family simply lay down together and succumbed, together, to exposure, to despair, or to something else that medical examiners would later be unable to determine with any certainty at all. Each theory explains something the others don't. None of them explains everything. And that unresolved friction between competing explanations is precisely what has kept this case alive in true crime circles for well over a decade. Before we follow this case any further into the mountains, it's worth pausing on something that investigators and mental health professionals who've reviewed this case have circled back to repeatedly. A rare, genuinely documented psychological phenomenon known as folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder. It's a condition where two people, usually bound together by an extremely close relationship, a married couple, a parent and child, siblings who've lived in close proximity for years, begin to share the exact same delusional beliefs. It isn't that one person is simply humoring the other's paranoia to keep the peace. In genuine cases of shared psychosis, both individuals come to believe, with equal and total conviction, in a threat, conspiracy, or reality that exists nowhere outside their own reinforced perception of the world. What makes this condition so dangerous and so relevant to understanding what may have happened inside that house in Eufaula is the way it creates a closed feedback loop. In a healthy relationship, one partner's anxious spiral is often tempered by the other partner's grounded skepticism. Someone says, "I don't think that's actually happening," and reality gets a chance to reassert itself. In a shared psychotic disorder, that check disappears entirely. Instead, each partner's fear validates and amplifies the others. Bobby's belief in spirits on the roof doesn't get challenged by Sherilyn. It gets echoed, expanded, given a matching countermeasure in the form of a pistol and a series of increasingly urgent, hand-painted warnings. Two minds that might have recovered individually, given time, distance, or outside intervention, instead spiral together, each reinforcing the other's departure from consensus reality until neither one has any remaining anchor left. If something resembling this dynamic was unfolding inside the Jamison household in the months before October 2009, it would help explain some of the case's most disorienting details without requiring an external villain at all. It could explain the trance-like, synchronized movement captured on the home security footage. Not necessarily drugs, not necessarily coercion from an outside threat, but two people so deeply entrenched in a shared delusional framework that their behavior had become genuinely, visibly abnormal to anyone watching from the outside, including, eventually, the family's own cameras. It's a theory that doesn't require cartels or hidden cults operating in the wilderness. It only requires two people who loved each other enough to believe each other completely, at exactly the moment when believing each other completely became the most dangerous thing they could do. Of course, shared psychosis alone doesn't explain everything either. It doesn't explain the missing briefcase. It doesn't fully explain why a family fleeing their own imagined tormentors would drive toward a specific plot of land they'd apparently been planning to view for legitimate reasons. And it doesn't explain the unidentified presence suggested by the angle of that final photograph of Madison, which is precisely the maddening shape of this entire case. Every theory, examined closely enough, explains a portion of the evidence while leaving another portion stranded, unaccounted for, refusing to fit. For 4 long years, the Sans Bois Mountains kept whatever answers they held buried beneath layers of snow, fallen leaves, and the slow, patient erosion of time. The Jamison family's disappearance became a cold case, discussed in local news retrospectives, and increasingly, as internet true crime communities grew, discussed and dissected by strangers who had never met the family but couldn't stop thinking about that locked truck. Then, in November of 2013, 2 deer hunters walking through dense brush, roughly 3 miles from where the abandoned truck had originally been found, came across something that stopped them cold. Lying side by side, face down in the dirt, largely obscured by years of fallen leaves and undergrowth, were the skeletal remains of 2 adults and 1 small child. The remains were so severely decomposed after 4 years of exposure that medical examiners were ultimately unable to determine an official cause of death for any of the 3. There were no bullet holes visible in any of the recovered skulls, no fractures consistent with a violent physical struggle, no definitive forensic marker pointing toward homicide, accident, or any specific, nameable cause at all. They had, as far as the physical evidence could ultimately confirm, simply lain down together in that spot, side by side, and never gotten back up. Think about that detail for a moment, because it's arguably more unsettling than almost anything else in this entire case. Not signs of a chase, not signs of a struggle, a fight, an attempt to run or hide or fend off an attacker. Just a family, together, in the position you'd expect from people who had reached a point of total physical or emotional collapse and chosen, or simply been unable to do anything else but stay together until the very end. But the most disturbing single piece of evidence connected to this case didn't come from the remains at all. It came from a cell phone recovered from inside that locked truck, all the way back in 2009, sitting in an evidence locker for years before anyone thought to comb through its camera roll in detail. Buried among ordinary, unremarkable family photos was a single image taken on the very day the family disappeared. It's a photograph of 6-year-old Madison, standing alone in front of a rocky outcropping somewhere on that mountain. Her small arms are crossed tightly over her chest, in the universal, instinctive posture of a child trying to make herself smaller, trying to protect herself from something. She isn't smiling. Her face, even through the low resolution and poor framing of the photo, reads as pale, drawn, and unmistakably frightened. She's looking directly into the lens. But something about the angle of the photograph has bothered investigators and researchers alike for years, because it doesn't quite read as a parent's casual snapshot of their daughter enjoying a day trip in the mountains. It reads as though someone else was holding that camera. Someone positioned at an angle her own mother or father likely wouldn't have chosen, capturing an expression that looks less like a child posing reluctantly for a family photo, and considerably more like a child staring at something, or someone, that had genuinely frightened her, just moments before that shutter clicked. Who was standing behind that camera? What was inside the brown briefcase that vanished while $32,000 in cash sat untouched? And what did this family actually encounter on that mountain, in the hours between loading that truck like sleepwalkers and being found, 4 years later, lying together in the dirt with no clear cause of death anyone has ever been able to name? There's something particularly unsettling about a case where the physical evidence eventually surfaces. The truck, the remains, even the final photograph, and still leaves you with fewer definitive answers than you started with. Most missing persons cases, even the tragic ones, tend to resolve into some recognizable shape once the remains are found. An accident, a confirmed act of violence, a medical event with a clear physiological explanation. The Jamison case never gave investigators that closure. 4 years of searching, followed by a discovery that raised as many new questions as it answered, is not the ending true crime audiences are used to getting, and it's precisely that lack of resolution that has kept this particular story circulating for well over a decade. Consider, for a moment, just how many separate, independently strange details this single case contains, each one demanding its own explanation, and none of them neatly connecting to form one coherent picture. A family gripped by shared paranoid delusions serious enough to involve spirits, weapons, and elaborate security systems. Security footage capturing behavior so mechanically strange that investigators themselves struggled to categorize it as either drug-induced or coerced. $32,000 in cash, deliberately left in plain sight, in a location where cash is rarely abandoned by accident. A briefcase that vanished entirely, its contents and its ultimate fate never accounted for. A dog that somehow survived alone in a locked vehicle for days. Remains showing no forensic evidence of violence, found lying peacefully side by side. And finally, a single photograph of a terrified 6-year-old girl, apparently taken by someone who was never identified, on the last day her family was ever seen alive. Any one of these details, taken in isolation, might have a mundane, if tragic, explanation. Taken together, they form a pattern that has resisted every attempt to fully resolve it, whether by law enforcement, by journalists who've revisited the case over the years, or by the enormous, dedicated community of amateur researchers who have spent over a decade combing through every available detail, hoping to find the one overlooked thread that finally makes sense of everything else. It's worth pausing here to remember something easy to lose sight of in a case this strange, this cinematic, this endlessly discussable. At the center of all of this speculation is a real family. A little girl who should be in her early 20s right now, who never got the chance to grow up. A mother and father who were, by every account, struggling desperately with something long before that final trip into the mountains. Struggling in ways that, had circumstances been even slightly different, might have been treatable, survivable, recoverable. Whatever combination of untreated mental illness, external threat, or circumstances we may never fully understand led this family up that logging road, the Jamisons weren't characters in a story built purely for entertainment. They were 3 real people who, for reasons that remain unresolved to this day, never came back down that mountain. It's worth understanding, at least briefly, exactly what kind of place the Sands Boys Mountains actually are, because the terrain itself plays a quiet but significant role in why this case has never been resolved. This isn't a manicured state park with marked trails and cell service every few miles. The Sands Boys Range is genuinely remote. Dense forest, steep and often unstable terrain, logging roads that wind for miles without any consistent maintenance, and vast stretches where a person or a family could walk for hours without crossing paths with another living soul. Search and rescue teams who've worked this region in other, unrelated incidents over the years have described the difficulty of the terrain itself as a serious obstacle, long before you factor in the additional years of exposure, decomposition, and forest overgrowth that had already reshaped the landscape by the time those 2 hunters made their discovery in 2013. The region has also long carried a certain reputation among locals, the kind of half-documented, half-folklore territory that exists around most large stretches of American wilderness, involving stories of isolated communities living off the grid, distrustful of outside contact, and reportedly resistant to any form of government or law enforcement presence. Whether any organized group with genuinely hostile intentions was operating in that specific area in 2009 has never been conclusively established by investigators. But the reputation itself is part of why the cult theory took hold so quickly and persisted so stubbornly in the years following the disappearance. It wasn't invented from nothing. It grew out of a real, pre-existing local awareness that these particular mountains had, for decades, been the kind of place where people occasionally went looking for privacy that bordered on complete disappearance from mainstream society. There's also a broader, more sobering context worth acknowledging honestly. Cases involving people who vanish into large, remote wilderness areas and are never fully accounted for happen with more regularity across the United States than most people realize. The specific combination of factors in the Jamison case, documented paranoia, a mysterious briefcase, an unexplained photograph, sets it apart from the more common pattern of hikers who simply become lost or injured in difficult terrain. But the underlying difficulty of searching thousands of acres of dense forest, of tracking any meaningful trail once weather and wildlife have had even a few days to erase physical evidence, is a challenge search teams face in wilderness disappearances across the country, year after year, regardless of how mysterious or mundane the underlying circumstances eventually turn out to be. None of this resolves a single unanswered question in the Jamison case specifically. But it does help explain why, Once that truck was found locked and abandoned with no trail leading away from it in any discernible direction, the search effort, however well-resourced, however dedicated the volunteers and law enforcement involved, was always working against terrain that had a considerable head start in swallowing whatever evidence remained. Somewhere in the middle of every true crime retelling of this case, it's worth remembering that the Jamisons had a family beyond the three people who disappeared. Parents, siblings, extended relatives who spent 4 years not knowing whether Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison were alive somewhere, being held against their will or already gone. Sherilyn's mother, who spoke publicly on multiple occasions in the years following the disappearance, became one of the most persistent voices pushing back against the assumption that this was simply a case of psychological collapse or drug-related tragedy. Her insistence on the possibility of a violent, organized cult presence in that region wasn't presented as idle speculation. It came from a place of genuinely refusing to accept that her daughter, her son-in-law, and her granddaughter had simply walked into the woods and succumbed to their own unraveling minds without any external explanation at all. That tension between investigators working from the physical evidence available to them and grieving family members carrying their own theories, informed by years of watching a loved one's mental state deteriorate before this all began, is a pattern that repeats across countless unresolved cases, not just this one. Families often hold on to external explanations, in part because they offer a version of events that doesn't require reconciling the person they loved with a mind that had become, in the final months, someone they no longer fully recognized. There's no way to know, from outside this family's private grief, which version of events actually happened on that mountain. But it's worth sitting, for a moment, with the fact that for 4 years, this family lived without any resolution at all. Not even the difficult, painful resolution eventually provided by 2 hunters walking through the brush in November of 2013. They lived with a locked truck, an untouched pile of cash, a missing briefcase, and absolutely nothing else to hold on to. Imagine what those 4 years must have actually felt like from the inside. Every unfamiliar car driving slowly past the house. Every phone call that came in late at night, answered with a held breath, hoping against hope that this might finally be the call with an answer, and dreading, in equal measure, that it might be. Birthdays that came and went for a little girl who should have been turning 7, then 8, then 9, with no way to know whether she was out there somewhere, frightened and alone, or whether the family had already found their answer long before anyone else did. Grief that couldn't fully begin, because grief requires knowing, at some level, what exactly you're grieving. When the remains were finally found, they were laid to rest together, the way they'd apparently spent their final hours. Side by side, a family that had, whatever else remains uncertain about their final days, stayed together until the very end. So here's the question we always leave you with, and tonight it feels heavier than most. What's your theory? Do you believe this was a drug deal that spiraled into something no one anticipated? A confrontation with an isolated, dangerous group hidden deep in those mountains? Or the devastating, entirely human culmination of 2 people's minds slowly giving way under pressure no one around them fully understood until it was already too late? Leave your theory and your thoughts in the comments below. This is one of those cases where every answer only seems to open up a darker, more complicated question underneath it. There's a particular kind of dread that cases like this one leave behind, and it's worth naming directly, because it's different from the fear you get from a straightforward horror story with a clear villain and a clear resolution. This dread comes from the absence of an ending. Most of us instinctively want our darkest stories to end somewhere solid. A confession, a conviction, a definitive cause of death that lets the mind file the case away and move on. The Jamison disappearance refuses to offer that. Every piece of evidence recovered over the years has only ever pointed toward more evidence that doesn't fit cleanly alongside it. Think about what it would actually mean to stand where those 2 hunters stood in November of 2013, 4 years after a family vanished, coming across 3 sets of remains lying peacefully side by side in the dirt, with absolutely nothing about the scene itself explaining how they got there or why they never moved again. No struggle, no obvious injury. Just the quiet, undisturbed stillness of people who had, for reasons that will likely never be fully known, simply stopped. And now think about that photograph one more time. A 6-year-old girl, arms wrapped tightly around herself, standing in front of a rock formation on a mountain she would never walk off of, looking at someone the camera itself never revealed to us. Somewhere out there, if that photograph really was taken by someone other than her own parents, is a person who knows exactly what happened in the hours after that shutter clicked. A person who has never come forward, never been identified, and may have simply gone on living an entirely ordinary life in the years since, carrying a secret that has haunted true crime researchers and a grieving family for well over a decade. Cases like this tend to survive, in the public imagination, not despite their lack of resolution, but almost because of it. A solved mystery gets filed away, discussed less and less as the years pass, eventually fading into a footnote. An unsolved one keeps circulating precisely because the human mind resists incomplete stories. We keep returning to the Jamison case, telling it and retelling it, because some part of us keeps hoping that this time, laid out clearly enough, in the right order, with the right emphasis on the right detail, the pieces will finally click into place. They haven't yet. They may never. Before you turn off the light tonight, think about that grainy security footage one more time. Two people moving like ghosts through their own front yard, carrying a briefcase that would disappear forever, driving toward a mountain that would keep their secret for 4 full years. Think about a small girl standing in front of a rock formation, looking at someone the camera never revealed in the last photograph ever taken of her alive. And remember, the next time you find yourself staring into the dark, uncertain of what might be looking back, sometimes the mountain doesn't give you an ending. Sometimes it just gives you enough to make sure you never quite stop thinking about it. Thank you for spending this time with us. This has been Midnight Whispers. Until next time, sleep if you can.